January 1970. The United States has been fully involved in the Vietnam War for 5 years, and despite President Nixon's assurances, there is no apparent end in sight. The youth of the country has been controversially drafted into Vietnam, and were expected to fight unconditionally. Teenagers and young adults who received draft notices fought reluctantly for their country and for their lives. Back home, their collegiate counterparts had lost faith in the war. Students were fed up with watching their friends and brothers die in a war they did not believe in. They had decided to take matters into their own hands. The student-led anti-war movement, which began at the start of the war in 1964, was one of the largest and most dividing in American history. Coming hot off the heels of the civil rights movement, these young college students had witnessed how to get their government to listen. It was not easy, and it would not be without tragedy. College students exercised their First Amendment rights by holding marches on campuses, boycotting class, writing songs, and holding rallies. The majority of protests embraced the peace and love vibes of the 1960s, but some ended in riots. The country was divided. The older generations, who had served bravely in World War II, were appalled at the youth's unwillingness to serve their country, and the younger generations were growing frustrated with their government's unwillingness to listen. Violence seemed inevitable, but no one could have predicted the events that would take place in the coming months. April 30th, 1970. After promising to withdraw troops from Vietnam, President Nixon announced his plans to send American soldiers to Cambodia. When asked about the student-led movement, President Nixon told the press that the protesters were nothing more than bums. This was the breaking point. May 1st, 1970. Protesters at Kent State University in Ohio had led a march through their town as a result of President Nixon's statements. The march began peacefully enough, but by the end of the night, the university's Army recruitment office had been burned to the ground. Protesters slashed fire hoses and blocked the fire department from saving the building. Afraid for their town, Kent called in the National Guard for protection, many of whom were no older than the student protesters. May 4th, 1970. A gathering of protesters was slowly growing on the lawn of Kent State's campus. As the crowd grew, the National Guard was ordered to disperse the students. They launched smoke bombs and moved in, but the students stood their ground. Some threw smoke bombs back towards the soldiers, and others even began to throw rocks. The guard advanced on the students, and panic and chaos escalated. Then, one nervous soldier changed the course of history. 4 students were shot dead on the campus of Kent State University. All it took was one fearful kid, most likely avoiding the war himself by joining the National Guard, to spread a chain reaction through the crowd. 3 more shots rang out, ending 3 more lives. In tears, teachers were able to subdue the crowd and the guard, and the bloodshed was over for the day. The students were later found responsible for their own deaths. The soldiers were never charged. After that, the movement changed. It spread like fire through towns and cities and eventually onto the nation's capital. The crack in the country had turned into a bleeding gash. Huge rallies for and against the war were held almost consecutively on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Students rallied out front of the White House, threatening to spill over the fence and onto the lawn. It seemed as though President Nixon would have no choice to listen, but the voice of the youth was still falling on deaf ears. May 15, 1970. Students at Jackson State University in Mississippi were holding a protest of their own. Hundreds came together to speak out against American involvement in Cambodia, and once again the National Guard was called to protect the school. Around midnight, the guard opened fire on the students, shooting the buildings and windows of the girls' dormitory. 2 students were killed. Again, the government was not found guilty of taking the lives of kids expressing their beliefs. Jackson State and Kent State served as a turning point for the war. The public took notice of what the government did to people who disagreed with the president's agenda. It would be another 5 years before the last American soldier would leave Vietnam, but there is no doubt the war would have been far more lengthy and costly if it weren't for a brave group of organized and determined young people to stand up against their government. The organizers of the anti-war protests would go on to involve themselves in other important movements throughout history, like the women's movement and the gay rights movement. The activism of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s showed a nation that change is possible if you are willing to stand up for what you think is right. We would not have the country we live in today if it weren't for people willing to disagree with their government.